morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kei Kawanishi. I'm a doctoral student studying under Dr. Tajino. And today I have the honor to introduce our very special guest, Dr. Hanks from Leeds University. And Dr. Hanks is receiving her doctoral degree from Leeds University, but she did her master's at Lancaster University under the supervision of Dr. Dick Alright, who also supervised my supervisor, Dr. Tajino. So it was perhaps this Lancaster connection that encouraged her when we asked her to come and give us a talk, and she agreed to squeeze us in her very tight schedule in Japan. So she was originally here as a plenary speaker for JALPENSIG, which was happening over the weekend in Nagoya. I believe this is her third time in Japan, as she was in Kobe for international seminar, Understanding the Language Classroom and New Directions for Language Teaching Research, held in March 2007 by St. Catherine's College, Oxford. And the fruits of the conference resulted in this book, and Researching Language Teaching and Learning. And I have another book by Dr. Judith Hanks, so I will, pass around the book later on, so you can check. And one of the main themes of the conference was exploratory practice, which is one of Dr. Hanks's research interests, and the theme of her talk today. Exploratory practice, in brief, is an approach to language teaching that appreciates quality of life in the classroom. And today she is going to give us a talk titled Exploratory Practice in Academic Writing Classes. So without further ado, I will turn the floor over to Dr. Hanks. Please join me in giving her a warm hand of welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Very, very happy to be with Professor Tajino and Professor Smith. It's a real pleasure to be able to come to Kyoto and to talk to you today. Some of the slides that I'm going to use today were also used in the plenary on Saturday. So if anybody was there on Saturday, you may recognize a few of them. However, we didn't have any chance to talk about those slides or ask questions at the weekend. So I'm hoping we can use this opportunity to actually discuss a little bit further and to go a bit deeper into what exploratory practice might mean. Okay, so to start off with, in the book that Kay mentioned there, that I wrote with Dick Alright, who is our sort of mentor figure, I would say, we developed 5 propositions about language learners. And I think maybe just to start things off, maybe to spend a few moments asking you to either sit quietly or talk together and just think, what do these things say to you? Do they raise any questions? Are they puzzling to you? Do they seem obvious? What do they say to you? I should say, by the way, we are recording, as you can see, and I'll be coming around the room with my little microphone. If at any point you think, no, I don't want to be on the microphone, I don't want to be on the recording, just make a gesture like this and I'll go away, okay? Okay, so could you take just 2 minutes to look at those and talk to the person next to you, or sit quietly and reflect? What do they say to you? Okay, shall we come back? So, shall I just talk through what those mean to me? Dick and I spent many hours kind of hammering them out and changing our minds and putting new ones in and taking old ones out. But we ended up with these 5 points, and we thought this idea that learners are unique individuals in the sense that everyone learns in his or her own way. So we tend to assume that classes are kind of homogeneous groups, but in fact they're made up of lots and lots of individuals who learn individually, have preferences, have relationships that they have to negotiate. So all of these things mean that they are unique individuals. At the same time, they are social beings. So learners are people who often learn in a group. We are human beings after all. We interact socially. So we can't forget the social side of learning in a classroom. And that adds sort of complications to the sense of being individuals, but also in a society or a culture that we create together. Learners are also capable of taking learning seriously. This one, I was explaining on Saturday, this one came about because I overheard conversations in my teacher's room. I worked in the language centre at the University of Leeds for about 10 years, teaching English for academic purposes. And I heard my colleagues coming in and they would say things like, "Oh, those learners, they're so lazy. They didn't do their homework. They didn't prepare. They didn't do what they were supposed to do." And I was thinking, I wonder why the teachers are so angry about this. We've all been learners ourselves. We've all done the same things. So why are they so angry? And when I discussed this with Dick, we tried to find some possible reasons. And one thing that we thought of was, well, maybe it's because as teachers, we know that learners are capable of taking learning seriously. They can do it, but for many different reasons, they don't do it. And so as teachers, we maybe feel disappointed that things are not happening as we expected. So we felt, well, learners are clearly capable of taking learning seriously, but maybe they don't always do it. They're also capable of taking independent decisions. In other words, in many ways, just coming to the classroom is an independent decision. But also whether you take out your pen and write things down, or whether you sit quietly and listen, or whether you switch off your brain but sit there, present physically but absent mentally. There are many, many decisions that we make as learners. So we're capable of taking independent decisions about our learning. And many, many learners, when you ask them, what do you do to learn English? Actually, they don't always tell you about going to school. They'll tell you a whole load of other things they do outside the classroom, which are sometimes very surprising, whether it's using the internet, whether it's talking with friends, whatever it is that they're doing, they have a life outside the classroom as well. And so they make these decisions about what to do, where to put their energy, all the time. And the final one, that learners are capable of developing as practitioners of learning. Now, normally when we talk about practitioners, we usually think about teachers as practitioners. So this idea of practitioners of learning, I think, is quite an interesting one and worth developing perhaps. That learners come to our classes, they're not empty. They've had experiences, unless they're very, very little, but usually they've had experiences. They've had experiences of learning. They have opinions and things that they like to do or they're less keen on. They are practitioners in the sense that they know the world of the classroom. Yeah. So, but they're also not finished in their development. So they're continuing their development as practitioners of learning, as I am continuing my development as a practitioner of teaching. Okay, so that's where those 5 propositions come from, and they underpin all the things I'm going to talk about today. Okay. So that kind of links to the next slide, where I was thinking about many of the questions, the way we start in EP. We often start with a question about why. And more specifically, I wonder why. And what I've put up here is, you can't see them very clearly, but there are a couple of posters that my students prepared probably about 5 or 6 years ago now. And one of them is, why does it always take me so long to use a new word, although I understand? And this student or this group of students had done a whole investigation of, well, we know the vocabulary, and yet we don't use it. Yeah? So why? Why does that happen? And I thought that was quite interesting. I can't actually see the other one. So I think it was why. Well, I can't see it. Okay, so we'll move on, because I can't see it. So I need glasses. So in my institution's tradition, we always do an overview of a presentation. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about today. So one of the things I was thinking about was, what challenges do we have as practitioner researchers, so as teachers or as learners trying to do research. I'll then talk about, well, what is exploratory practice? Because I know some of you, particularly on my left here, are well versed in exploratory practice and know a lot about it, but maybe some other people are quite new to it. So we'll take that area first. And I'll discuss and ask you to discuss the 7 principles that make up the framework for exploratory practice. I'll talk a little bit about puzzlement, which is something that I'm particularly interested in, and then I'll talk you through a case study of EP in practice on an EAP course. EAP is English for Academic Purposes. So that was a course where students were being prepared for academic study in a British university. And then I'll make some final remarks, and then we'll have some time for questions as well. Okay, so some of the challenges for practitioner research. When I was doing my PhD, I was looking at what might make it difficult for teachers, or what do teachers say when you ask them, why don't you do practitioner research? And looking at the literature, I've just given a very brief outline there, but there's a lot of literature about it. Teachers or practitioners often say, I don't do research because I have no time. I'm busy. I'm busy teaching, yeah? Or I'm busy learning. So time is a challenge. Often people say that the research agenda is not relevant. Yeah? So very often people doing research, they sort of say, well, this person is doing research. He or she is separate from me. I'm the teacher or I'm the learner, but that person, the researcher, is different. Okay? And the same for the findings. Often teachers and learners, if you ask them, do you read research? If they're not doing a master's or a PhD or an undergraduate degree, the answer is probably not much, yeah, realistically. And again, there may be many, many different reasons for that, but one of the reasons they often give is, according to Borg, Burton, Zeichner, Nofke, is that the findings of research are generally perceived as not particularly relevant. Yeah? Perhaps it's too abstract or obtuse. Other challenges, I think, are that people say, I don't have the physical resources, like the space, the technology, don't have the mental resources, whether that's to do with being tired or whether that's to do with expertise, which is in the next line, and also, of course, financial resources. So there are quite a few things holding people back from doing research in classrooms. Okay. But exploratory practice seeks to kind of overcome those challenges, or at least to address the challenges, by suggesting these 7 principles. So it's attempting to incorporate research into our language classroom, language learning lives. Yeah? And we have these 7 principles, and I'd like you again, please, to spend just a few minutes talking to the person next to you or sitting quietly and reflecting on what do these say to you. So just a few minutes to talk together. Okay, so once again, can I bring you back again? It's quite interesting sort of standing up here as a sort of almost like an expert. I've worked with exploratory practice for a long time, but I still would not consider myself the expert. So these are just my opinions about what is written here. But we can discuss further as well, and I hope that you can add insights too. So the first one, put quality of life first. I think this comes out of a reaction. Exploratory practice started in the 1990s, the early 1990s, when Dick Allwright went to Brazil and was working with teachers in Rio de Janeiro. And a lot of exploratory practice work has been going on there, very, very exciting things that they've been doing. But at that time, the teachers were often working 2 or 3 jobs, different parts of the city, running from one place to the next, sometimes in quite deprived areas. And they were very, very busy just teaching. But many of their institutions, like my institution in fact, were insisting almost that they had also to do research or scholarship or publications, so doing extra things on top of their teaching. And I think this idea was actually making people feel quite exhausted. Yeah. So the idea of putting quality of life first, I think, comes from the notion of whatever we do in the classroom, it should be to try to enjoy our lives in the classroom. Yeah? We have to spend a lot of time there, so let's try and make it enjoyable. And I'm going to come back to that because I think some of the stories that I tell you later hopefully will illustrate what I mean by that. The second one, work primarily to understand language, classroom language learning life. I think that comes from a reaction against, at the time, there was a lot of talk about problems, and problems which demand solutions. So if we think back to that first poster I showed you, the question, why can't I use vocabulary? That could be presented as a problem. I can't use my vocabulary. And we could come up with lots of different solutions to that problem. Yeah? But the solutions don't really tell us why is it difficult? Why is this happening? And actually, I think the why question is a much more interesting question because really, in many ways, as learners, as teachers, we know the solutions to these problems. So a typical problem might be, why do my students not speak English in the English class? Yeah? And we can come up, I've seen over the years, I've seen different solutions to that, where you can put your hand on a red square if you want to use, in this case, Japanese, and a green square if you want to use English, or all sorts of different ways. I've also seen teachers making students pay a fine if they use English. You could get very rich that way. So solving the problem, because students don't want to pay a fine, so they speak in English, but we don't really understand why do they want to speak in their mother tongue. Maybe there are times when it's good to speak in the mother tongue. Could that be possible? Are there reasons why they're doing it? So exploratory practice places great emphasis on this idea of understanding, trying to understand before we try to solve the problem. Yeah? Maybe as part of the process of understanding, we might solve the problem. Or maybe we might realize, oh, actually, it's not so bad after all. I've just understood a whole range of different reasons why people do this. And again, I'll come back to that later. The next three I see as coming as a group. And in fact, I talked a little bit about this on my second visit to Japan in Kobe. So the idea of involve everybody, work to bring people together, and work also for mutual development. To me, this is all about being inclusive in the classroom. Yeah? So involve everybody, I think, again, came as a reaction against, in the 1990s, I don't know if it's still continuing, but in the 1990s there was this big divide between academics and practitioners. And you would have often academics coming into the classroom, observing, taking notes, maybe videoing and so on, going away, writing up their research, and the people in the classroom would never hear from them again. Yeah? What exploratory practice is trying to do is to say, let's come together. Let's try to involve everybody. Let's work to bring people together. In other words, this idea of mutual understanding. What helps me, for example, doing my PhD, what helps me to get my PhD, hopefully also helps my learners, my colleagues, whoever else is involved. Yeah? And what helps them helps me, what helps me helps them. So these three, I think, are kind of very closely interlinked. Number 6, make the work a continuous enterprise. Again, this comes from a reaction against ideas in the past, and a little bit how I feel about my PhD now, that you work and you work and you work, you have your project, you're so busy, you're reading, you're researching, you're analysing, you're writing up, you get to the end and, oh, thank goodness for that. Don't ever want to do it again. Yeah? But actually, in exploratory practice, the idea is that you can continue. Maybe you're doing something different, maybe a different question, maybe the question that you were investigating, perhaps that raises more questions. Often it does. Yeah? So make the work a continuous enterprise, one which does not have an end point, but one which can go on and develop. And the 7th one, integrate the work for understanding into existing curricular practice or practices. To me, this was crucial. The first time I came across exploratory practice, I was very tired. I'd been teaching for at that time, about 10 years, and I was, like many of the teachers in Brazil, I was almost burnt out. Yeah? I didn't want to face the classroom again. But as a result of finding out about exploratory practice, and I have to say, as a result of working with Dick Allwright, I regained an interest in the classroom. Classrooms are interesting places, and actually it was more enjoyable. And in fact, now I love my teaching. Don't take me away from the classroom. I want to be there. And one of the reasons for that is that there's this integration of whatever we do to try to understand into existing curricular practices. So using our normal teaching and learning activities as a way of investigating. And I'll maybe go into that in more detail in a moment. So the idea is you minimize the burden on the teacher and you maximize sustainability. Yeah? So that you're using what you would normally do in the classroom. Nothing, or as little as possible, nothing new. And this, I think, also is quite crucial to exploratory practice, this notion of puzzlement. I came across this quote from Paulo Freire. He's not an exploratory practice person, but I think his ideas, his thinking, is an influence on exploratory practice. So he talks about an education of I wonder rather than I do. Yeah? And I think that that's an interesting line to follow up. Okay. I think then that puzzlement is very, very important in exploratory practice. So being puzzled, kind of thinking, oh, I wonder why. Yeah, that is crucial. And also the idea of ownership. Who owns this research? Who's it for? Who's it by? Yeah, and how that hopefully becomes relevant for the participants. But then, who are the participants? And a quick quote from Dick Allwright, that he suggests in 2003 that learners can be involved not as the objects of the research, but actually as fellow participants and therefore as co-researchers. So, and I think that's a really nice quote. I find that quite exciting when I read it, that learners can be researchers as well. Yeah? And then I found a very interesting quote from this book, which was quite useful for me in my PhD, talking about student-teacher collaborative reflection and how that can contribute to better learning and teaching. Yeah? This idea of sharing responsibility, because in the same way that the teacher says, oh, my students are lazy, maybe the students are also saying, oh, my teacher's horrible. Gives us too much work to do. So the idea that we move away from that discussion and we actually say, okay, we are all responsible here. Everyone takes responsibility for achieving and sustaining an educational quality of life amongst the practitioners. So I thought I'd start by asking, well, what do teachers puzzle about? I've spent about 10, 12 years collecting puzzles from my colleagues, people I've worked with as a teacher trainer, and so on. And I thought you might be interested to see what some of these teachers have said. So, first one, I don't know if this is at all familiar to you, but one teacher said, why do some students feel their ability is higher than it is, while others are permanently pessimistic? Really interesting question. I don't know the answer. But you find that, don't you? Some students are like, yeah, I'm fine. Others, no. And you say, no, but you're good. Yeah? Another teacher, I don't know if you have this same problem with IELTS in Japan and other exam classes, but this teacher was saying, why do some students have unrealistic expectations of their ability to do well on IELTS? IELTS is an international English language testing system, and our students in the UK become quite obsessed by IELTS for good reason. It's the way into the university. If you get a high enough score, you can do your master's. If you don't, you can't. Yeah? So, but why do they have an unrealistic expectation, whether it's too high or too low? Again, an interesting question. Another teacher asked, why do my students often speak more in monolingual groups despite their expressed desire to be in multilingual groups? And again, this is quite interesting. Working in the UK, we have this opportunity. We have all sorts of different nationalities. But why do they kind of separate off into their different national groupings? Even though they say, I want to practice my English. And again, very interesting question. Why do I never finish the work I set out to do with all the class? This is a common question for teachers. And why do so many students fail to follow advice about learning outside class? This teacher, I won't tell you all of the story about him or her, but it was quite interesting. When this person investigated the question, they found that actually the students didn't follow his or her advice, but they did all sorts of other things. Very, very useful things as well. Okay. So, another few moments to discuss together. So, you are all, I believe, certainly language learners, but also teachers, I think. So, what puzzles you about your language teaching or your language learning experiences? Take a moment just to think. If you'd like to write it down, that's fine. If you'd like to talk to somebody, that's also fine. Okay, sorry to stop you again, but I'm aware that time is ticking by. So what this led to was my own questions. I thought, about 10 years ago, I thought, AP sounds interesting. And I thought, I wonder why everyone doesn't do this. Because at that time, what was that, 2005, 2006, when I was writing the proposal, as far as I knew, nobody was doing exploratory practice in the UK in an English for academic purposes situation. So I was thinking, well, why doesn't everybody do it? It sounds good. And then I thought, why don't we do it in EAP? So then I thought, why don't I try? And that's really what my PhD was about. Oops, sorry, I'm just going to go back a sec before I talk about that. So one of the things that I was thinking was, in English for academic purposes, probably the same here as in the UK, it's a very intense experience. It's high stakes. In my situation, people have often given up their jobs, or they've left their families, or they've come a long way, they've paid a lot of money to come and study in the UK. And these courses are very goal-oriented, and they're often considered, sorry to say it, but they're often considered a little bit dry, a little bit boring, because there's listening to lectures and taking notes, reading and note-taking, writing and extended writing, so going way beyond IELTS, the 250 words to 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 or more. So I was thinking, well, I was a little bit worried. Maybe EP is not right for this kind of situation. Maybe nobody does it because it's actually not the right thing to do. But I thought, well, I'll give it a try. Let's see what happens. Yeah. So what I'm going to talk to you now about is what happened with the students on one particular course. These were students, I did 2 case studies, one with students going on to master's degrees. The other one, which I'll talk about today, was with pre-undergraduate students. So it was preparing students for undergraduate degrees in the UK. Some of the students actually were already undergraduates in Japan, and they were on their study year abroad. So they were a kind of mixture. But they were around about 17, 18. I'll tell you a bit more about them in a minute. So, I had a number of students. I'm going to talk to you mainly about Japanese students because I thought their experiences would resonate with you. I have included one other nationality who I'll tell you about because his was most interesting about writing. Okay. So, what puzzled these participants? I gave them a talk at the beginning and I talked about exploratory practice in the same way that I'm doing now, perhaps a bit shorter. But many of the same things. And I asked them at the end of the talk to write down their puzzles. That talk had two functions. One, of course, was to explain EP and to get them thinking about their puzzles. But the other was to give them practice in listening to a native speaker for nearly an hour, 45 minutes. Which I don't know how you feel right now, but I find listening to somebody for an hour is a long time. To just sit and your brain kind of wanders and you, what am I going to have for my dinner? And so it's giving them practice because they're going to have to do this in the UK, and the lecturers in the UK make no concessions for anybody. They just talk, and you have to try and catch up as best you can. So it had two functions. Questions that the students asked, there was an interesting amount of common questions. Oh, I should say, by the way, these are not their real names. I could talk a long time about that for another day, but I've tried to use mostly Japanese names, pseudonyms where possible, but for some of them they wanted other names. So Kai, for example, why can't I speak like I think? Actually, Kai had about 3 or 4 different puzzles, but these were just 2. Chiho, why can't I express my feelings? Why can't I speak like I think? Why can't I speak like I think? Kelly, who was another Japanese girl, why are Japanese good at writing and Saudi Arabians good at speaking? Ted talked about why do people learn bad words more easily? He'd been going to parties and the other students, British and other nationalities, they'd taken great pleasure in teaching each other rude words in their different languages. And Ted, he was a very nice student, quite sporty, so he was not shocked exactly, but he was surprised because he said, in my country, we would never use these words. They are so rude. So why? Why do people do that? And yet we learn those words very quickly. Those are the ones we remember. You can see people laughing. His teacher at the time, when he asked this question, she was kind of thinking, oh, is this a good idea? Because maybe he's just trying to play games in the classroom. Maybe he's not serious. Maybe he just wants to use bad words in the classroom. But she thought, okay, I'm going to go with those 5 propositions. He's capable of taking learning seriously. I'll take his questions seriously, and he can investigate it. And in fact, he found out a lot of very interesting information. Ahmed, who's the Saudi Arabian student in this study, why don't I like to learn another language from my mother tongue? What he meant was, when I asked him, why don't I like learning English? Which, considering he was about to spend a year studying English, and then another year on a foundation year, and then 3 years of his life on a bachelor's degree, this was kind of worrying. But interestingly, he said, I don't want to investigate this question right now. I have another question. I'm going to join with that group over there. And then I'm going to have their question, which was, why can't I study in certain situations? And what he meant by this, I think, was some people find it easier to do their studying in the library. Other people, no, that's really not the place for me. Some people find it easier to study at home. Other people, no, there's no way I could study at home. So that was their question. I've also included the 2 teachers' questions, just in case you're interested, but I'm not really going to talk about the teachers today. But Bella talked about, why can't my Middle Eastern students spell? This is a big question for her, and it started off as quite a frustrated question. Why can't they spell? But as she went through the process of exploratory practice and really thinking about it and discussing it with the students, she found out all sorts of things that made her realise, oh, actually it's a lot more complicated than I thought. And maybe I have some sympathy with them now. Yeah? And Jenny, who said, why do students find it difficult to remember or recall vocabulary? Interestingly, very similar to that student question from much earlier. Okay, so I'll talk you through the case study. I've told you a little bit about my situation. It was very intensive. It was an 11-week EAP course. There were the 2 teachers and there were the learners. I should say, by the way, sorry, the learners, it was a course of 75 students. But of course, there was no way I could interview all 75. So I asked for volunteers, and these were the people who came forward. I think most of the Japanese students were study year abroad, whereas the Saudi Arabian student, I think he was straightforward preparing for study, for his undergraduate degree. So what happened? 5 weeks of the course included an EP strand, and that meant 4 or 5 weeks of 1 or 2 classes per week. We have 90-minute classes and 21 hours a week. So only 2 out of 15 classes per week were spent actually doing EP. The students thought about their puzzles, they investigated their puzzles, they collected some data, they began to analyse their data, and then they did some poster presentations. And as a follow-up to that, they did, for the final weeks of the course, they did a group writing project, a kind of methodology assignment. So quite interesting, because many of them had never written together in a group before. Yeah, so it was quite a strange situation for them, and they had to negotiate a whole load of different interactions. Okay. So what did they say? Very briefly, Kelly was talking, and this was quite common to many of the students. She said, oh, it's very fresh. I feel stimulated. I've not changed their writing very much, their speaking very much, by the way. I've kept the sort of more or less what they said. And I said, why did you choose this puzzle? This was her answer. She thought, oh, the Saudi Arabians, they can speak very fast. I'm shocked. And I don't know if any of you have had this experience, but when she first came to the UK, she'd been studying English for a long time. It wasn't that she didn't know English, but she arrived and it was like, ooh, I can't say anything. And here are these people in my class who can really speak fluently. Yeah? So she found that quite shocking. And she was surprised that they had so many opinions. They talked so fast, she couldn't say anything. Yeah? And I don't know, but I think that's quite a common response. As she went through the process of investigating, she worked with one other Japanese girl, and then she was really happy because a Saudi Arabian joined the group as well, so they could work together. They went round and they asked other people, what do you think? And they divided their poster up in the end into the responses that they got from the people they'd asked, so other students. And they had this sort of list about, they found, interestingly, that it was a lot to do with the likes and dislikes. So people who don't like writing. And a lot of the Saudi Arabian students, according to them, said, well, I just don't like it. But speaking, I don't have a problem. On the other side, so they've got, when I'm speaking, grammar is unreliable. So I suppose this was the students who felt uncomfortable speaking, yeah? That they didn't feel confident of their grammar. They also went and tried to do the beginnings of kind of a psychological approach and talking about what's happening in our brains. And they talked about that the Japanese students they spoke to had an extra step when they were trying to speak. So they would try to formulate what they had to say. Often they would translate it and then they would say it. And this seemed to slow them down, whereas the Saudi Arabians seemed to just have 2 steps. Formulate and speak. Lucky them. But this is, I think, not new for you, not new for many people, but for these students, this was a revelation. Oh, that's why I'm finding it difficult to speak, because I'm actually adding in an extra step. They also gathered teachers' opinions about this situation. The teachers' opinions quite often turned into kind of advice or almost stereotypes. So they were talking about the differences that come from culture. I always worry when people say that, because you think, well, what is culture and how do we define that, and can we really say? But it was, this was what the teachers were saying. So Kelly's poster was quite an interesting one. Chiho, on the other hand, she, going back to the EP principles, she talked about, she found exploratory practice interesting. She was in a different group, and she said, well, in the lecture we can learn a lot of things, but we are studying and the teachers are also studying. So as we're doing this exploratory practice work, our teachers are studying alongside us. It's not like they have the answer. We're finding out together. So, she said, the interaction is very beneficial to both teachers and students. So, quick run through. So, as part of all of this, the learners set their own research agendas. That's the puzzles. They work together to explore their agendas, and often working together with their teachers as well. They worked with the teachers to collect or generate data, analyse the data, and I should say, again, often the first response was, I don't know the answer to this, I'll ask my teacher. But actually, what I think was very productive about this was they could move away from asking the teacher and asking other learners, other people, either in the class, outside the class. So they found a whole load of other information which was not just belonging to the teacher. So they collected this data, they analysed it, and they prepared their presentations. And as I said before, those presentations were not the end point. They gave the presentations, the poster presentations, and then they wrote their methodology assignments. All the time that they were doing this, they were practicing key language skills. So obviously speaking and listening. And interestingly, they did manage to keep to English the whole time. I didn't hear the teacher saying to them, oh, English please. Yeah. They seemed to regulate their own English use. They had to write the assignment in English, and that whole process of writing was quite interesting as well. At the same time as doing all of this, they were also practicing their academic skills. So they were practicing writing questionnaires or doing interviews, both of which are quite difficult things to do. It was interesting to note that they often chose to do questionnaires. We tried to persuade them to do other things, but they seemed to like questionnaires. So they practiced those language skills and their academic skills while they were doing their EP. So I'll move on fairly quickly because I think I'm running out of time. So the why don't I speak English as well as I think? Chiho again talked about Oh, I've put that twice, sorry. Yeah, Ted. This is the guy who was talking about learning swear words, remember? And I don't know if you can see behind them the poster. One of the things they talked about was fun, that it's fun to learn rude words. But they also, you can't really see it because the guy's head's in the way, but they also found kind of psychological and social reasons for using swear words, that it was a way of building relationships with people, particularly as British people at that age group used a lot of swear words normally. So it was a way of joining the group. It was a way of identifying yourself as part of that group to use those words. So they went beyond the kind of surface level and went a little deeper. And Ted actually said he actually ended up taking this question and taking it into another project that he did as well. And he compared British and Japanese use of swear words. So I asked him why, and he said, well, I found the common thing is that we don't actually mean it when we use those bad words. Yeah. So for him, again, that was quite an interesting, quite surprising finding. And he went on to say, and I talked about this on Saturday, it's interesting to do this work because something like recycling, which is a very typical language classroom topic, he said, well, we know we have to reduce things, we know we have to do recycling, and I can't really find any point to write an essay about it. But something new, this swear words, I can write about it. Mainly because I don't know the answer yet, so I'm finding out. Ahmed, who was an interesting person in himself, he talked about this idea that education is not just teaching, it's teaching from one side and learning from the other side. So there's a two-way process going on. And I thought that was quite interesting. He went on to tell me about his writing experience. And he found group work difficult. He actually said, I don't really like group work. But here we are, working in groups. And he said, and he had chosen to work in a group. We'd given him the option, would you like to work alone? No, I want to work with these other people. And he said, at the very end, they had to write this assignment together and they were doing it separately. And he said, before I wrote the conclusion, I felt sleepy. So I go to my bed and I told them, send the assignment to my email and I will write the conclusion and I will look at everything. Yeah. And there are many things that we can correct, he said. When I woke up, I opened my email and I found the report, found the assignment. And he said, honestly, I was really surprised. And I said, well, why? And he said, I didn't expect it to be that good. So he had low expectations of his co-group workers. He didn't think that they would have such a good piece of work. But they sent it to him and he thought it was good. So he was kind of evaluating other people's work. And he then went on to evaluate his own learning. Because he said, I didn't expect it to be that clear. Yeah, there were many opinions, but I found it very, very clear. Especially using connection words. And these were words that he went on to say. The connection words were words that he didn't really use very well, he felt. He tended to write very long sentences, all connected with the word and. Yeah, so and this, da, 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 and this, da, 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 and da, da, da. So he noticed what the other people in his group had done using words like however, or nevertheless, or in addition, yeah, and how they'd used that to improve the piece of work. Okay, so I'm coming to the end. But he said, I don't know who wrote the conclusion. Remember, this was supposed to be his job. Somebody else had done it for him. But I don't know who wrote the conclusion, but he wrote it in a very good way, which included the main ideas. So he was analysing his own experience of writing and his own ability to write by looking at what his group mates had done. So he said, I was very surprised, and in a good way. Okay, so I'm going to come to the end in a moment. The last things I want to say, and hopefully you'll have questions about what I've talked about today, but I think that exploratory practice, almost to my surprise, because as I said at the beginning, I was not sure if it would be the right thing to do, a good thing to do, but actually it opened up a whole lot of opportunities in an in an EAP situation. One of the things that I thought was that because the students and the teachers asked the questions themselves, it made the work they did relevant. Yeah? And because the work was relevant, it was then also preparing them for their future studies. So in fact, it honoured their needs. My worry was that, like so many pieces of research, it might take it away from what they needed to do. But actually, it really was integrated into their study. The other thing that I think that happened, that I noticed as part of this, was that there was a great deal of mutual development. The teachers began to understand more about the learners. The learners began to understand more about each other and also about the processes of learning, whether that was speaking or whether that was writing. They learned more about what they were doing. And this next one, the integration of the work for understanding into the teaching and learning, in my view, that led to a quality of life. It was very interesting. One of the teachers said to me, you know, these students, quite often they come to school late, they're a bit sleepy, maybe they don't always pay attention. But she said, I saw a student running up the stairs to get to class, and I know he was absent this morning. But he was running to get to the EP class. There was something that they seemed to really enjoy it. And I hesitate to say that because I don't want to say, yay, EP is wonderful. But it did seem noticeable that these people were enjoying their learning. Yeah? So that was where I thought this idea of quality of life comes in. What they did helped them to learn, but also helped them to enjoy being in the classroom. Yeah? It accessed and allowed creativity in what is often seen as quite a dry subject area. And as I say, it led to this lively, creative atmosphere, and that meant motivation. We didn't have to motivate the students, they were already motivated. So, exploratory practice then, I think, releases this potential for creativity. It has the relevance to the participants, it increases the engagement of the participants, and more than anything else, I think it develops our understanding. It developed all of our understandings of what was going on. We didn't reach a final conclusion. How could we possibly in 11 weeks? Maybe it's a lifetime's work, but we developed our understanding. Little steps, little incremental steps. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much. And I'm going to ask you a final question, which might start the discussion off, which is how might you incorporate EP into your academic writing classes? So, thank you very much. Anything else?
All right, so thank you very much for an insightful talk. And Grace Smith Sensei is very familiar with classroom research and practitioner research, so we'll ask him to give a few words.
Do you want the microphone? I think we
really.
should.
No.
If I have to
Perhaps
suffer,
I'll just
you have to
stand up
suffer.
here so I can see everybody. Well, I'd just like to say thank you so much to Judith. I think she's given us a kind of fresh approach to reimagining teaching and learning. And that's the important thing, to reimagine our teaching and learning as a shared enterprise. You know, so often we go into teaching because we want quality of life. So we liked being students, and we like schools, and we can find quality of life, we hope. But sometimes the pressures of school work, as Judith mentioned, can get us down and kind of confused. But still, you know, we go into schools, we can get our quality of life because we have a place where we can explore, and we like puzzles, and we like asking why, and this is what exploratory practice is all about. I think it's just related to the basic reasons we want to be teachers, or we like being learners. In schools we have so much independence, and maybe for some of us, compared to working for an insurance company or being a salesman for a manufacturer, school is a delightful place where we are free of all that. So what I think Judith is telling us, we have to enjoy that freedom. We have to appreciate that independence and the opportunity to collaborate with our students. And we also get this satisfaction from teaching because it's important, right? We can really feel that it's important. So when I'm listening to Judith Hanks and Dick Allwright, I always get the feeling that they care about their work. The exploratory practice is their way of caring about what they do. And when I've seen Kei-san and Kyoko-san teach, it's quite obvious they care about their students. I'm sure all of us here in the room do, and through what we do in the classroom, we get the students to care about what's going on. And our classrooms become these special places where we can create a space for us and the learners where, you know, we close the doors in classrooms. Hardly anybody comes in, right? And if somebody comes into our classrooms, students have kind of power, even if it's somebody in the administration, because the classroom is theirs. So what goes wrong, I think, sometimes for us is when we get a textbook or something in the way. So, or we get some curriculum aims in the way. So somehow we have to do what schools want us to do, but exploratory practice is reminding us to make, when we're moving towards those goals, we have to make it enjoyable. We can't let curiosity disappear. We've got to keep curiosity alive, and I think that's what exploratory practice is all about, because that's what gives us quality of life, right? We all have this will to meaning. We've got to find meaning in our work and in our study, and I think that's what exploratory practice is all about. And you know, so Judith, her work is in trying to bring this into language teaching. But in our universities, it's already in law, and it's in engineering, and it's in chemistry. It's in all these other disciplines. They are doing exploratory practice constantly. They're always doing case studies. People are in labs and experimenting. But we're not doing that enough in language classrooms, I think. And that's what exploratory practice is encouraging us to do, right? Yeah. To work together to answer some puzzles, not just to go through the motions. So Judith, thank you so much.
Thank
We're
you.
so happy to see you, and
Oh, thank you.
it's great that you're here with us in Kyoto.
I'm very happy
Thank you
to
very
be
much.
here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.